Mr. Ross, for the first 80 years of our nation's history, the size of the Supreme Court changed with some regularity. Why was that? Microphone.
Pardon. Yeah, the expansion of population. Originally, the justices were chosen largely on geographical grounds, and the justices rode circuits. The justices wore two hats until 1891. They served as circuit court judges, and they also served as U.S. Supreme Court justices. And in a smaller nation, there were only 4 million people in the 1790 census. There was less need, for a larger court. As the country expanded, as the number of circuits expanded, the number increased, but only to 9. From 5 to 9, maximum of 10, and then only for 6 years, from 1863 to 1869, there were 10, and since 1869, we've had 9. And so, that's a long history, a century and a half with 9 members. And it's worked very well so far. And, in my opinion, that ought to be the number.
Well, let me follow up then. So in 1869, when Congress did pass that Judiciary Act, why did they set it at 9 justices at that point, do you feel?
Well, if the court divided, then that would be 5 to 4. If you have 10, then the court could be split. If the court splits and the lower court decision stands, but it's generally better to have a decisive decision of the court. So 9 permits the court to divide one way or the other.
And has been alluded to a couple times, when President Roosevelt tried to unsuccessfully in 1937 to expand the court to 15 justices, was there any sound logic to this expansion that the president was using or making, or was it merely an overreaction to a Supreme Court that had repeatedly struck down the New Deal?
Historians are unanimous in or virtually unanimous. Historians are never unanimous on anything, but about as unanimous as they can be, that the court packing plan in 1937 was politically motivated. The Supreme Court had struck down a number of significant New Deal statutes in the previous 2 years, and the Social Security Acts and the National Labor Relations Act were coming up for adjudication before the court. These were the signature legislation of the New Deal, and Roosevelt was understandably worried that the court would strike those down. And so his remedy, was to increase, the number of justices, to pack the court, so that the Social Security Acts, both the old age pension and the unemployment compensation laws, and the National Labor Relations Act, which was hugely important at a time of industrial unrest, would be secure. And so, Franklin Roosevelt originally claimed that he was doing this because the Supreme Court was overworked and the justices were geriatric. There were 6 of them who were over the age of 70. That's why he chose 6, one new justice for every justice who was over the age of 70. But the older justices were, for the most part, quite vigorous, including Louis Brandeis. Chief Justice Hughes was in peak of health, despite his age, over 70, so that it was so disingenuous that it was almost laughed at. And so Roosevelt, about a month after he introduced the plan, admitted that his motives were frankly political. By the way, the then chair of the House Judiciary Committee, Hatton Sumner's, Democrat, opposed Roosevelt's plan from the very first day. That's why Roosevelt introduced it in the Senate rather than in the House.
Very good, thank you. So there's already this morning, there's been some attacks on the Supreme Court by some of my colleagues on the other side over, just as a former clerk, Mr. Capozzi, you state in your testimony that if too many come to view the Supreme Court as a partisan actor rather than a neutral arbitrator of law, the losing parties would be tempted to disregard court orders. What would that mean for our government as a whole? I know that's a big question.
It would mean the end of the rule of law, plain and simple.
Do you think that there are certain parameters to criticizing the court, or is that unacceptable beyond the First Amendment?
I think it's perfectly acceptable to criticize the Supreme Court. People always have. Presidents from the beginning of our country have lost major cases before the Supreme Court. President Jefferson frequently criticized decisions from the Supreme Court. I think there's a line between criticizing decisions, criticizing their reasoning, and attacking the legitimacy and the independence of the Supreme Court itself.
Very good. I yield back.